Sunday, 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 Sunday. I visited the world-famous tank museum here at Bovington, and I saw tanks. There's one. Big tanks, bigger tanks, small tanks, even smaller tanks. Tanks with names I cannot pronounce. Hey look, it's Squire. Models. Models. Creepy mannequin. Pigeon. Stare into the eyes of Montgomery. This bit looks like wartime France. I'm in a trench now. We did it, boys. We found the beef.
Where's the beef?
Oh, hey, that's a Hornsby & Sons traction machine. Actually, that's one of the very first ever tracked vehicles and whose very existence inspired the world's first tanks. This machine is a... Will you stop it with these creepy-ass horses? Ah, yes, the superior German trench. Complete with the fancy wood paneling and all the IKEA furniture you can eat. Clearly proving the superiority of the German war machine, which is why they lost. Twice. Maybe I should actually go look at more tanks while I'm in the tank museum. There's one! Does this car look familiar to anyone? Oh hey look, it's the engine that Red Effect thinks is in the Challenger 3. There's another tank! I've spotted a whole 3 tanks so far, I'm doing well. I wonder if I can find any in here. Oh look, it's the Tiger! We all seen it? Alright, let's move on. 3 buckets of water! Well, this is getting me demonetized. Oh look, it's a chieftain! The tank whose name eerily reminds me of that one guy who sat at his desk and told me to be less dramatic. Me? What does that even mean, chieftain? I'm a goddamn drag queen! What am I supposed to do with that information? Oh hey, a Hago! I didn't even know they had one of these. What's this tank museum? That's not a real tank. I've been over this. What are you doing to me? So we meet again. T-34. Behold, the superior Russian craftsmanship. Oh hey, it's Fury. And it's Michael, the first Sherman ever produced. So shiny. Yes, child, slap the panther. And then I stopped for lunch. Yeah! Anyway, I spent a long time in this museum looking at tanks. In fact, I spent so long looking at tanks, my camera ran out of batteries. Twice. And then I had to borrow another camera from the tank museum, which didn't have the fancy stabilization that mine does, and apparently I was holding it upside down, so all the footage looks like this. But I had a great time. I got to rub my butt in the tog, therefore claiming it forever as mine. And I hid a little secret in the tortoise. So go find that if you dare. Also, I wanted some good footage of the yak tiger they have, but there was this creepy guy standing in front of it, and he kept touching it in kind of weird ways, and he wouldn't leave. But anyway, the museum is 100% worth a visit. Their collection was a lot bigger than I thought it was, and was presented quite well. Outside of the creepy horses. Okay, they talk to you, by the way. They talk. You walk past them, and they start talking.
And practicing charges across the countryside. There was time for games too. We played polo and went riding at the weekends.
I wasn't prepared for that. Also, these two, they're dead. All right, those horses, they're dead. They're talking about how they're on the magical farm up in the sky and the endless fields and everything. They're dead, okay? They're talking about how they're dead. There's even a display. I couldn't get a good picture of it because my camera fucked up and there was children running around everywhere at this part. But there's another part a little bit further on where there's a horse being crushed by a tank, okay? If you can go to the museum, go there. Go now. Go to the museum right now and confirm for me that that's there before they have a chance to change that display. It's horrific. Anyway, outside of that, I did genuinely love the aesthetics of the displays. I mean, part of it was like stepping into a movie set. That World War I bit was, that trench genuinely felt like it was an actual trench. It was really cool. I mean, they're also a museum that does a lot of interactive stuff for kids and semi-adults like me, which I do find a lot better than the bog standard everything behind glass and big signs saying, do not touch. There's also this massive section that's just World of Tanks, because Wargaming gave the Tank Museum a shitload of money, which is why they can afford to do stuff like this.
We want to bring this strange-looking prototype back to life in time for TankFest 2024, but we need your help. In a partnership between A.W. Hughes, World of Tanks and the Tank Museum, we want to conserve and cosmetically restore the turret, reuniting it with the correct Centurion Mark III chassis. We want to remake the gun cradle and other fittings that were unique to this unusual vehicle. And then we want to display it in full running order before the crowd at TankFest 2024. We need to raise £20,000 to match the amount generously pledged by World of Tanks. This will cover the costs of the project, which will be undertaken at the A.W. Hughes workshop in Leicestershire.
Seriously, play World of Tanks. But of course, any of you can come to the museum and enjoy these fine displays, and I strongly encourage you to do so. And many people have such videos of them walking around and talking about what they can see, and I was originally going to do that, but then most of the footage that I had screwed up, so I couldn't. But what about what you can't see? Well, thanks to the powers of being a fairly nice person, I was granted exclusive access to the Vehicle Preservation Centre, where the Tank Museum keeps its collection of tanks typically not on public display. Now, normally this is a guided tour that you have to pay for. Most of the time you are required to stick to certain paths or remain up on the overlook balcony. I mean, they do this because people try to take souvenirs, including up to, as one of the staff admitted to me, an entire 50 cal machine gun. So when you go to this building, you have to stay up on the balcony and you just look at the tanks. But not me! I was left alone in this giant warehouse completely unsupervised.
The fools!
So I did what any tank lover would do when left alone in a big room full of tanks. I touched everything. Screw your barricade, society! I'm breaking all the rules. So come with me on an adventure where I look at stuff and talk about it. Because I will admit something. Standing up there, looking at this giant room full of tanks, sound of rain hitting on the roof, the smell of diesel in the air, I think, in this one moment, I was the happiest I have ever been in my entire life. Anyway, let's go look at tanks. Now, gentlemen, this is the T-14. No, not that one. This one actually works, though it would never see service. This was a joint project between the Brits and the Americans to build a heavy tank based on British experiences of tank combat in the war thus far, which, as we all know, is to win some of the largest and most brutal tank batteries in history thus far, delivering some of the first major victories over the Nazi Empire to the point where images of British tanks were used as propaganda by the Soviets in leaflets that were dropped over the troops defending Stalingrad in a sort of, look, the Nazis can be beaten. If they can do it, we can too kind of deal. And then have everything you've ever done, all your developments, all your victories, all the sacrifices you made completely swept aside and forgotten about because some Americans on the internet want to remind you that your country is the size of an Arby's parking lot and thus your opinion doesn't matter. Something, 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 tea in the harbour. Anyway, the T-14 was supposed to rectify a lot of the problems encountered during the development of the M6 Heavy, and thus, to ease production, it would share as many components with the M4 Sherman as physically possible, hence why it looks like a heavily up-armoured Sherman, because basically it is. Couple of problems. The tank has this massive shot trap right in the centre where the machine gun port is. It also has absolutely horrible cross-country performance. On rough ground, it was like a pair of old women in the shopping aisle in front of you. You aren't getting past them, and they are going to take their time. It was eventually decided that this just didn't offer much value over the already in-service Churchill tank, and was thus scrapped. Though the Americans would never adopt the Churchill because, why would they? Two were built as testing vehicles but were later sent to the scrap pile, but this one was sent to the UK for evaluation and was thus rescued from the scrap heap, and it has been sitting alone, gathering dust in this building ever since. That's a Sherman Jumbo, I'll talk about that one in a second, but this is the A33 Excelsior. And you have to say it in that tone, you have to say it Excelsior. You can't say Excelsior, it's Excelsior. I don't know why, but that's the law. That's how you say that word. Essentially, this is just the same as the T-14, just an attempt to make a heavy tank by up-armoring a medium tank, this time with a Cromwell instead of a Sherman, hence why it looks like a rectangle on wheels. It's got much beefier suspension to handle it, if you can't tell, because of the wide tracks, but it does have the same problems. It's slow, it's bad cross-country, it's a nightmare to maintain, and it's got the same gun as the regular Cromwell, so really what's the point? You'll note this happens a lot. There's quite a few allied projects to make heavy tanks that end up just not really going anywhere, and they always have the same gun as the medium. I don't understand why. There are two versions of this. This is one of them. The other one, which I'm going to call the Excalibur, but I don't think that's quite right. Not sure where that one is, or even if it still exists anywhere. And this is the Sherman Jumbo. It's literally just a Sherman with a 105mm howitzer and a lot of extra armor. This was the eventual result of the T-14 project. They just got a regular Sherman, added a shitload of ballast to it, drove it around and found that yes, it can actually deal with the increased weight of the extra armor and bigger guns without the need for a bigger, fancier suspension or whatever else. So they built one with extra armor just strapped onto it, about 250 of them. But something interesting is these were considered experimental vehicles. Because there was this idea that the Allies would be facing waves upon waves of increasingly heavier German tanks and the Pershing wouldn't be ready in time, they needed something to fill the gap. And because of that time pressure, the manufacturer, the Fisher Body Company in Detroit, just kind of skipped the testing period. I have noticed though, for a jumbo, this has got the wrong turret. So there was an attempt to build more jumbos in the field just by driving regular Shermans into French steel mills and then just welding extra armor to the front. This might be one of them, or this could just be a regular Sherman with a howitzer that I am completely misidentifying. Feel free to shout at me in the comments. Also, fun fact, this was never actually called a Sherman Jumbo. That was a post-war nickname given to it by a modeling company. This one has a radiation tag on it. Some of them do in here, but those tend to have like night vision and stuff, so I'm not sure what's causing this. Let's not touch it and find out. Now this is the famous Springer, also known as the I am so glad I was not in the Wehrmacht in 1945 tank. It's basically a kit and trad with about 10mm of armor strapped to it, which you'll be thankful for because you sit in the back, and about 300 kilograms of explosives sit in the front. And the idea is you drive towards the enemy with them shooting at you with their guns, and then just before it explodes, you jump out. And you've got this little radio set that you can use to control it the rest of the way while you are being shot at. For some reason, didn't quite catch on. Perhaps because 10mm of armor would maybe protect you against most small arms, but not anything beefier. They were also pretty unreliable, and the radio control just sometimes didn't work, which was fun. But more importantly, this is the Landsverk L60. It's a Swedish tank, if the little flag hadn't given it away. Now this is a tank that I know almost nothing about. I know some of these were used by the Hungarians, which formed the basis for the Toldy tank, which were used mainly on the Eastern Front against the Soviets, which you typically hear absolutely nothing about, because no one gives a rat's arse about anything anyone did during the Second World War apart from the Germans, the Americans, and maybe the Soviets. Seriously. You want to tell me something that Hungary did during the war? Anyone? Leave a comment. Leave a comment so I can read it and then I'll say it now. No one? Alright, let's move on. Ooh, before I do, Ireland has one of these. It's in running order. Ireland used these as their main battle tanks, by which I mean they had two of them, okay? They were still in service right up until about the 1960s, I want to say. Anyway. The A7V. Well, this is a replica because they only built like 20 of them, and then they were all scrapped in 1919. The last surviving one is called Mephisto, and it's in Australia. I do want to go see that at some point, but it does mean going to Australia. There was another one. It was taken to America as a war trophy, and they scrapped it in 1942. Why? I don't know. Anyway, A7V. They were shit, basically. There's no real easy way to say this. Tanks were shit back then, and the A7V was probably the shittiest of them all. And I include in that the Whippet, which was built for speed, but the exhaust is on the side, and at speed that exhaust blows directly into the driver's face. British design, perfect, no notes. The A7V had almost no cross-country performance, barely any armor, and you couldn't see out of them for love nor money. But they are famous for being involved in the world's first tank-on-tank battle at Villers-Bretonneux, which the Tank Museum recently published an old out-of-print book about. I think you can buy it at their store. It's worth a read, trust me. What else? Right, this is a replica. I did say it was built locally by Bob Grundy of the British Military Vehicles Company. No, sorry. The British Military Vehicles Company! Which is a company that specializes in the restoration of old military vehicles. And can I just say, he has done a remarkable job. I mean, if you want to see this thing run, I think they do take it out of the shed during special events and they run it with their replica Mark V, which was built for the movie Warhorse, which probably explains all the creepy horses in the World War I exhibit. Oh hey, it's a Panhard EBR, 2 of them actually. This is a weirdly interesting piece of kit. Its design actually comes pre-World War II, if you believe that. The French wanted this heavy armoured car, and Panhard built basically this. It was utterly revolutionary at the time. Tires are bulletproof, it's got these 2 massive steel wheels here, which lower down to give you more grip while travelling cross-country. Crew of 4, though the original had just 2, has an impressively minuscule ground-to-weight pressure, and it can run on like the worst fuel imaginable. Like the shittest fuel. Like the kind you get at a gas station in rural Arkansas at 4 AM when the attendant notices your out-of-state plates and you can see him switching something under the counter, grinning at you as he jacks up the price of what is essentially just ethanol and water. Anyway, the French built 1 prototype before the fall of France in 1940. The prototype was shipped to Morocco and no one's really quite sure what happened to it. Well, everybody knows what happened to it, but nobody wants to say. Now, I know this is French, and as a pommy Britbong, I really should be vomiting in my tea for praising a French vehicle, but you forget, I'm actually Scottish, and there is a very long, very old treaty between Scotland and France called the Old Alliance. They help us out, we help them out. I have no shame, therefore, praising French vehicles. Panhard AML. Magnificent little thing. Fans of Wargame Red Dragon will know this vehicle very well. Recon armoured car built for airborne deployment because the French were very into their paratroopers at this point, because paratroopers are big and manly and muscles and sweaty and something homo, I don't know. Developed in the 1960s, production continued right up until the 1980s. This has seen action in about 50 different conflicts under various nations, including Israel, Portugal, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, Egypt, El Salvador, you name it. That gun will put a shell through a T-55. Very useful if you're fighting in a Soviet Union proxy war. Just saying. This is the, hang on, let me go back and get a better look. Ah yes, one of those, the Alvis Saccharin. These are quite rare to see intact like this, with a turret and a gun and everything. Famous for being unbelievably uncomfortable and difficult to drive. It requires you to sit in a school chair from the 1940s and spread your legs like a dockyard whore. The steering wheel is backwards and sits on the opposite side of the steering column, and of course, you can't see a damn thing because you want to lean forward, but it's completely impossible. I'm talking from first-hand experience here, trust me. There was a mounting on top for a Bren gun, which was intended as an anti-aircraft gun, which is very optimistic in the jet age, but hey-ho. These things are still in service. They're very, very cheap, very durable, not much can go wrong with them, so much so that cops in the United States use these as SWAT vehicles and mobile penis extensions. It was also used by a British protest movement called the Space Hijackers, who were... You know what, I'm struggling to define for the space hijackers actually were, because you know what, they were a lot of things. But if you've ever attempted to resist the rule of the British Empire, then you're probably very familiar with these. They have been involved in almost every anti-British colonial conflict since the 1960s, including Yemen, Malaya, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, South Africa, and of course, Ireland, where the locals refer to them as the Sixers. Well, they refer to them as other things, but I'm trying to be polite. Look, okay, I don't know what the locals actually refer to these things are. I've just known enough Irish people in my life to know that they would never look at a British armoured truck and call it a Sixer. Oh, come out, you black and tans, come out and fight me like a man. Ah yes, the Aerogavin. Very famous vehicle, as we all know. Brainchild of the legendary Mike Sparks. This one doesn't have the wings attached to it for storage reasons, but you can see where the detachable wings would have been fitted. There's the porthole for firing your gun out of, bit up top where the pilot sits, and of course in the back you can see this is actually an early paratroop variant of the Aerogavin. So it doesn't come equipped with the camping showers and the strawberry daiquiri vending machines as seen on later models. This one actually has a cup chair as opposed to the standard stripper pole, and going around the front you can really take in the elegant aerodynamic shapes of the Aerogavin, which gave it that legendary flying brick performance. And here we can actually see this is a Canadian Aerogavin, which explains the cup chair as opposed to the stripper pole. God, what a magnificent beast. Now from the camo scheme, I'm guessing this is Swedish. Let me take a good look at it. Sorry about the thumb. Ah, yes, the Hugland Van 91. Okay, this is technically an infantry assault gun, or sometimes wrongly referred to as a light tank. Quite rare, very interesting little thing, basically designed to lob large heat shells at things. Not very good at taking out tanks. They were briefly replaced by Centurions because of this, before being fully replaced by the CV-90 in the 1990s, which is honestly one of my favorite family of vehicles. I love the CV-90. David Willies did a tank chat on this, which I suggest you go watch, because beyond that, I know almost nothing about this thing, other than it being overshadowed by the ultimate, supreme Swedish tank, which I saw just over here. The Stridsvagn 103, or the S-Tank, as it's often known. This is the one tank that every tank nerd loves, and it is beautiful. Very happy to finally see one of these in real life. I don't think the Tank Museum quite appreciates how much money I would have happily given them to get to drive this thing. Not that anyone should ever trust me with driving a tank. Anyway, turretless tank, famous for its ability to lean. The Swedish during the Cold War were kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. They didn't want to side with the USSR, but the alternative would be having a shitload of American bases in your borders and having to do whatever America tells you, and likely being used as a sacrificial lamb to protect the more important European trade centers to the south. Yet they envisioned that even by remaining neutral, should they get invaded by the USSR, then NATO would eventually come to assist. But they would have to hold out for a considerably long time before that assistance arrived. So they built things like this. Knowing they couldn't fully take on an armoured assault by the USSR head-on, their idea was essentially to use delaying tactics, ambushes, and guerrilla warfare tactics, which the terrain of Sweden very naturally favours. I mean, rolling a massive tank brigade into Sweden would be a very difficult thing to do in the best of times. So you can see this tank is very low down, it's very squat, can be very easily hidden, and it can do one thing that many other tanks can't, which is shoot down from quite a high angle. And to top it off, they're even amphibious. Very useful, very handy. It also has something very similar to the Char B1's precision transmission, which gives it this unparalleled turning capability. You have to turn the tank to aim the gun, and you can actually turn this entire tank in degrees as small as a millimeter, so that never feels like a problem. Only real weakness is it cannot fire on the move. This is strictly a stop and shoot tank. The gun has no stabilization outside of the tank suspension. Even with that in mind, this is a fantastic tank. It's a big favorite for many a tank nerd. Wish I'd known they had one of these, because I'd already filmed my video for the Tank Museum at this point. But anyway, one thing before we move on. Gas canisters around the site. Yes, those are supposed to be full of fuel. Now that may seem a bit weird, why you'd strap explosive flammable liquid to your tank. Well, for one, you need to do it anyway. Most tanks carry massive drums full of fuel because tanks are thirsty, thirsty boys. And if you're planning to spend days or weeks out in the country ambushing Soviet tank columns, you can't have a trail full of fuel trucks following you around everywhere. Secondly, if the fuel does get hit, it then drains out the side as opposed to splashing all over the top of the tank. And also, in a kind of weird roundabout way, which was completely unexpected at the time, they are surprisingly effective at blunting the penetration of things like heat rounds, which is what a lot of older generation Soviet tanks were using to compensate for not having the more modern guns. And over here is, ooh, I see it. Hang on. No idea what that is. Oh, it's a ferret. Hi, ferret. One of those is currently seeing action in Ukraine. My sympathies to the poor crew. Yes. Now, I wondered why I couldn't find this in the main building. This is the Convenator. One of the worst tanks Britain has ever built. I mean, okay, one of. Fletcher did a tank talk on this, and he knows more than me on this.
And it gives people some idea of how awful some of our tanks were. If they're interested, that is.
I will say, supposedly 300 of these were earmarked to form a Home Guard armoured division. Now, for those of you who don't know what the Home Guard were, they were basically an ill-equipped corps of volunteers made up of people who couldn't join the regular army for whatever reason during the Second World War, famed for inventing a lot of wacky ways to stop the German invaders, including raiding museums for whatever they could find. They've actually got a couple of their vehicles here in the Tank Museum in the main exhibit. So an armoured division made out of all the weird and wonderful tanks that just happened to be lying around, like this, the TOG, the A1E1, sounded like a great idea. Supposedly, one Home Guard unit did reactivate an old Mark V tank called Excellent. I think that's one of the Mark V tanks here, not entirely sure. I know a lot of the old World War I tanks here do have quite interesting histories. But can you just imagine being a German trooper in 1941? You're on your leaky-ass barge, the might and power of the entire Royal Navy crashing down upon you, Warspite going full Nelson on you, leading a battle group of old Revenge-class battleships as as hurricanes dive bomb you at every opportunity. You get ashore, you get past the minefields, the barbed wire, the machine guns, there are grenades going off around you. You've got old gunpowder weapons being fired at you. You've got trebuchets flinging massive flaming barrels full of petroleum jelly at you, which sticks to the skin and ignites. You're getting shot at by crossbows, javelins, baked bean cans full of explosives. You could swear you just saw a British officer lead a cavalry charge into your flanks. An armoured tram pulls up, blaring Rule Britannia, and then to top it all off, this thing comes rumbling out of the fog and starts shooting at you. And then the ocean catches fire. Like I said, the invasion of mainland UK during World War II would have been one of the wackiest and hellish battles to have ever happened. Let's move on. Oh, found a Willys. Well, it's a West German produced post-war Willys. You can tell because one of the staff told me it was. Just gotta check one little thing right here. Oh, it doesn't work. You and me, baby, ain't nothing but mammals, so let's do it like they do. What's over here? Ooh, I see some things. Hang on. No idea what this is. I think it's a scorpion, but oh, what are you doing here? I need to get rid. I need to see him. Hang on. I thought he was the Imperial War Museum. I had no idea he was here. Hang on, this is a tight squeeze. Hang on, I'm very fat. There we go. Oh, what is that? Is that a panther turret? That has been royally fucked, whatever it is. Let's see if I can find another way around. Oh, hello. Black Prince. Just sitting here nonchalant. This was an attempt to put a 17-pounder anti-tank gun from like a Firefly into a Churchill. Only one was ever built, and it's just sitting here, covered in dust. This is a glorious vehicle. It was never put into service because they were sure the Centurion would be ready in time. The fools. Fantastic tank. I might come back to that. 2 seconds. Let me just squeeze past this ferret here. Ah, that's a nice World War II era Pershing. I know a lot of my viewers do appreciate a good Pershing. Let me just squeeze into it a little. And there it is, the Valiant, the worst tank ever to be produced in Britain. Famously so. It was so bad it didn't actually make it to the proving ground. The test was halted before it had even left the road into the yard. It was found the tank could not be operated without the driver injuring themselves. They also found the tank had absolutely terrible ground clearance, a tendency to smack off any rocks it was driving over. It would also shear off its own bolts. It would slowly sink on its rear suspension, and during the initial drive to the testing grounds, it developed an oil leak, and it started to spit hot oil all over the crew. It was also discovered that the steering levers and the clutch were so heavy the driver needed to be swapped out due to, and I quote, excessive fatigue. To get the tank into first gear, one needed a crowbar, and changing into fifth gear had a slight chance of snapping the driver's wrist. Also, the brake didn't work. It would struggle on inclines, and to top it all off, in order to perform maintenance on certain parts of the tank, such as the final drive, which is incredibly important, one would need to dismantle half the tank. This used to be displayed at the Imperial War Museum as an example of how not to build a tank. But I will admit, because this is me and because we always look at things from a different angle, it wasn't all bad. This tank has a lot of interesting features that you just don't really see on British World War II tanks, especially ones designed in 1942. It had these big doors on the side for the crew to escape from. It had a dual-purpose gun with the intention of being able to fire both armour-piercing and high-explosive shells, which no British tank could do at the time. It was also exceptionally well armoured, with 114mm of armour on the front and 102 on the sides. Those frontal plates angled up in a V-shape in a very similar way to the IS-3, which would have given this tank insane amounts of armour protection, equivalent to that of some of the later war heavier German tanks. In 1942, no tank in 1942 had 114mm of frontal armour. It was unheard of. That was more armour than the Tiger had. If this thing had been fielded in 1942, the 88mm flat guns the Brits had such a problem dealing with in the desert would have been next to useless. From the offset, this tank was very ahead of its time, but what happened with it was, well, the British happened. When you see the original designs and the mock-ups of the Valiant, it was clearly supposed to represent something closer to a later model Valentine, but the design was passed around from team to team to team, starting at Vickers, and it was shoved to Rolls-Royce, and then to Hornsby. Money for the project slowly dropped, and then dropped again. Priority for the project was gradually lowered, people lost interest in it, and eventually it was handed off to the design team who built the A33 Excelsior, the up-armoured chromo I showed earlier. And it was that team who implemented a lot of the changes that would cause the majority of the problems it had in its initial trial run. That trial also didn't happen until 1945. The design went back and forth and was neglected for so long. By the time the first prototype was built, it resembled almost nothing of the original design, and it was already pointlessly outdated. Had this tank had the priority, had it had the funding and the attention it needed, the Brits could have had one of the most spectacularly amazing tanks ever built in the war. But of course it's Britain, and in Britain we can't have nice things, because you need a license for nice things and then they'll tax you on happiness. I joke, but give it time. We have an absolutely fantastic Korea War Pershing here, and she is beautiful. Just look at that art. It's almost photorealistic. So the Pershing would do to a T-34 what the Tiger would do to a Sherman, and you know my thoughts on the T-34. People request a video on the Pershing all the time, I think largely because they want to hear their opinion in my voice, and my opinion is, it's a little bit overrated. I mean, it is a solid, very well made, very well designed tank, and if I was in World War II or Korea and I had one of these, I'd be very thankful, mostly because I know what the alternative is. But as the Chieftain said, the first time these things saw combat, the Tiger won. The second time, the Tiger lost. Now, there was a lot of reasons for that. Boldness was one of them. Crews were told that they had a heavy tank capable of going toe-to-toe with the heavier German tanks, so they were maybe not as cautious as they might have been had they been crewing a Sherman. Though that first kill was made because, well, it was during a night battle and a building caught fire behind the Pershing, which silhouetted it against the flames, and the Tiger was able to get a shot off. So it wasn't really machine superiority or skill, it was more fluke than anything else. Now, these things did arrive pretty late in World War II, and there's a lot of reasons why. Everyone has different opinions, and it would take a video in itself to go over just what some of them are. But if you've ever heard the name McNair said with a certain level of spite, that's where that comes from. Either way, it was sent over while it was still in its experimental phase, and thus each one had a small team of engineers following them around, fixing problems on the fly. But in Korea, where this one is from, this thing absolutely dominated. There are tales of the US rushing to get Pershing tanks out on time, including ripping them off World War II memorials and reactivating them. There was about 300 Pershings in Korea, and in spite of being involved in just 30% of all the tank battles compared to 50% by the Sherman, they caused nearly half of all North Korean tank losses. The T-34, even the 85 variant, could basically do nothing to a Pershing but dent it. And it wasn't until it started hitting the mountains that the flaws of the Pershing started to become apparent. That it wasn't particularly good at steep inclines or high altitudes, but, you know, by then the M47 pattern was available and that kind of took over. I think a lot of people like this tank because there's this big argument about what the first tank we can consider to be the first main battle tank was. Now, if you're Veriboo or your name's Steven Zaloga, that is the Panther. If you're British, it's the Centurion, and if you're American, it's the Pershing. Now, I'm not going to step into that argument because it's stupid, because the definition of what a main battle tank is so loose and vague, it could literally mean anything. So let's instead see what else we can find. Hi, it's post-production LazerPig here. I've just been informed this is not a Pershing, this is an M46 Patton. It looks exactly like a Pershing, but no, this is a Patton, apparently. Why are you like this, America? Why are you like this? You just out to make me look like an idiot, aren't you? I was having such a good day.
Knock knock, who's there? A funny joke.
Oh, beautiful example of a greyhound here, done up in the Battle of the Bulge colours, the whitewash dabbed over the green because it helps blend in with the snow-covered foliage a little bit better than straight up block white. Now, this might be an American one, it also might be a British one painted to look American, not entirely sure. The Brits did have these, but they never used them, they found them too lightly armoured. But the Americans absolutely loved them because they're incredibly light, very mobile, great for scouting, or if you just needed a 37mm cannon and a couple of machine guns at a certain location very quickly. One of these things took out a King Tiger. That's not a joke. It actually happened. Now, you still see these in use today. The biggest operator right now is, I think, Peru. I think they have about 30 of them. Oh, this thing here, I thought this was a 232 because it has 8 wheels, but it's not. This is a Marmon Herreting Mark 6. It's South African design. It's basically an attempt to copy the 232. 2 of these were built, never used because the transmission was absolutely awful. This is the 2-pounder variant. There is a 6-pounder variant in the South African National Museum of Military History, and in spite of all, I mean, you never see these things. No one ever talks about them, but I think they look neat.
I just think they're neat.
Also, I don't quite know what that is over there. I'm going to try and wiggle my way around to it. Oh, a charioteer. Okay. I didn't know any of these were left. God, these are awful. This is basically a 20-pounder gun from a Centurion on top of a Cromwell chassis. These were built very quickly to act as a stopgap until more Centurions became available. Because these were very quickly thrown together, there is no standardization between models. It was literally whatever model of Cromwell happened to be around at the time. So this chassis could literally be anything. Could be a Centaur. We'll never know because I ain't popping the hood to check. I can't even begin to describe how awful these things were. The turret basically has 0 armor, the commander cannot see, and in fact when the gun fires it generates so much smoke it not only immediately gives your position away, it also blinds the crew, so they can't fire a second shot. Now to solve this problem, the Brits decided to add another crew member to the tank, whose job it was to get out of the tank and with a pair of binoculars help the tank aim, which was not a particularly practical thing to do. I'm so glad we never had to use these, but you know, we did offer them for sale, and for reasons beyond my understanding, people bought them. And I'm not talking like South African nations or small African nations that had never owned a tank before and were excited to just literally have anything. Austria, fucking Austria, bought 56 of these, and Finland. Finland had about 30 of them, kept them right up to the mid-2000s and then sold them off. Why? I don't know. Just be thankful they were never used. Aha, this looks like a Patton. I'm going to say an M60. Okay, I will admit I don't know my Pattons very well, so feel free to scream at me in the comments if I'm wrong and this is actually an M47. What do I actually know about Pattons? They're huge. You don't really get a sense of scale of just how big these things are until you're right next to one. It's big. That's what she said. Sorry. Famously, these were originally intended to be nuclear powered, but that design never went anywhere for obvious reasons. I need my token American twink Falcon to lecture me on these, which he would happily do. Anyway, that looks like a Challenger prototype, but this, oh baby, it's a KV-1. Let me try and swing around and see if I can get a better angle on it. Here we go, bit of battle damage, but isn't she magnificent? If you were around for the early days of the game World of Tanks, you know that between tiers 3 and 5, you've got a very good chance of encountering these, and the game would basically be decided by how many KVs you had on your team versus the opposing, since almost no other tank could take one down. But if you got up tiered and faced tier 6 tanks, you were basically mincemeat. It was catch-22 with a KV. In real life, this thing caused one hell of a panic in German leadership, possibly more than the T-34, but the T-34 tends to take the spotlight and the KV typically gets pushed to the side. So essentially, okay, I'll go over this. So essentially there's complaints in the German High Command about the Germans' ability, or should I say inability, to counter heavy Allied tanks. In particular was the Char B1, which if used correctly had absolutely wiped the floor with German tank units. There was this one incident where a single Char B1 took down 13 German tanks in spite of being under heavy anti-tank fire the whole time. Now the Char B1s were deployed very badly. They had low fuel reserves and no infantry support. So the Germans were a bit worried, especially when a similar incident happened involving British Matilda IIs at Arras, that if they were to invade any military power who fielded heavy tanks and supported those tanks with artillery and infantry, then Germany basically had no response. Now, it's not quite true. They did have a response, and that was the 88mm flat gun, which was very successfully pushed into an anti-tank role. But that gun took specialist crews to operate. It took a long time to pack one up, move it, deploy it, and it was vulnerable the entire time it was doing this. So using it in the middle of combat, not particularly practical. And so they kind of highlighted all this to German High Command, and they were told, it's fine, no one's capable of deploying heavy tanks in large enough numbers that we can't handle. Until Barbarossa and the invasion of the Soviet Union, and they came face to face with these things. Massively heavy, massively powerful, very slow and impractical, many of them getting left behind by their crews during major retreats because they were just too slow and they couldn't cross bridges, but incredibly effective when they got the advantage. A small group of these managed to ambush an entire German tank column, absolutely devastated it. The German tanks could basically do nothing to the KVs, and then they just vanished back into the forest like that Homer Simpson's meme. Now that incident was the final straw, and that's where you start seeing the green light for heavier tank designs like the Tiger. It's also where you see a whole bunch of heavier guns suddenly fitted onto whatever existing chassis they could fit them onto. Kind of haphazardly. There's a lot of images of 88mm guns on Panzer IVs where there's the turret removed, and then later on you have designs for like the Marder II and then the Nashorn, and all of these were basically in response to things like the KV. Now I don't know much about this specific KV. I don't know if the words painted on the side are genuine. I'd be very interested to find out, but like I said, I am here unsupervised, which is great for me. I get to explore and touch everything, but not so great if I have questions. Oh, this is a BMP. This is a BMP-1, actually. First infantry fighting vehicle of its kind. You can see the portholes in the back where the troops could stick their guns out of. The idea behind this was pretty genius, actually. Well, not the portholes, but the vehicle itself. So previously, stuff like this, armored vehicles to drive troops around like the M113 and the Sakhalin I showed earlier, were basically just that. They were armored battle taxis designed to move troops around in relative safety. They'd drop the troops off and then they'd hide away somewhere in case those troops needed to be relocated again very quickly. The BMP was kind of the same function, but rather than pull back and hide, it would follow the troops it had just dropped off and give them support with its big-ass cannon. It's sort of a cross between an APC and a light tank. This utterly changed the game when it came to armored warfare. Absolutely fantastic little thing. Few problems. Firstly, it's not particularly reliable, nor is it particularly well armed. A 50 cal will go through this thing. This is partly because the Soviet generals were adamant that this thing be amphibious, so it had to be kept quite light. They were also stupidly cramped, very hard to get in and out of, especially when you've got your full battle kit on, and it was very difficult for infantry teams to carry heavy weapons with them when they were in these things, so they just often wouldn't. And of course the fuel tank runs under their seats, so one wrong turn of the minefield and everybody's dead. But you'll still see these in service in almost every former Soviet bloc country. I mean, for all their flaws, they built these things by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, and they are stupidly cheap to maintain. Found a comet. Everyone loves the comet. There's one on display in the main museum, so I won't go over it again. Next to it is something kind of fun. It looks like a Sakhalin, but it's got these massive nitrogen tanks all over it, so I'm guessing this is some kind of flamethrower vehicle? I don't know why my voice went all high-pitched like that. I want to go take a look at it, and this looks like a Matilda. Oh, this is not a Matilda. Jesus Christ, Tank Museum, how fucking dare you leave this all by itself in the corner. This is the Matilda II Canal Defense Light. Basically, it shines this massively bright light out of that slit and it blinds whoever you're pointing at it. The idea is that you could blind large groups of infantry so they can't shoot at you. You can also blind tanks, anti-tank guns. Anything using a telescopic sight would be rendered utterly useless by this thing. I think it was only ever used twice, and that was because the project was considered so secret, they didn't tell the commanders they gave this to what it was or how to use it, so they kind of just left them behind. I had no idea this was here. Fantastic. Anyway, I'm just gonna lean over. Sorry, I spotted an Su-76. I'm just gonna lean over the Matilda here and take a look at that. That is a beefy-ass flamethrower. Ye gods. Now this thing here, with the bubble things, I believe it's a Renault something. It's a French artillery tractor. It's got two men, one's the driver, the other guy is there in case you need to bum a cigarette off someone, because it's French. It's a tankette, it's got a machine gun on the hull. These are actually quite rare, and quite expensive actually. The last one sold at auction, I think as far as I'm aware, for about 100 grand. So if you have one in your barn. Now David Willis did a tank shot on one of these, and as you can see, it hasn't moved. Now, I do know a lot about this thing, but I don't know anything interesting about it. So let's move on to this more interesting tank behind it, which is this absolutely beautiful Finnish T-26. Now, you probably know this, but the T-26 is a modification of the British Vickers 6-ton tank, a tank that was basically made for the export market. Let me get a little closer. I think this is a T-26M? No, my apologies, it's a T-26B. That means this was originally Russian, then it was captured by the Finnish and pressed into service. Don't worry about the swastika on the side, by the way. That was a symbol of the Finnish Army and Air Force from about 1918, so well before all the Nazi stuff. You find this a lot, by the way. The swastika now is seen purely as a Nazi symbol, but pre-Hitler was a fairly common thing, and you'd find them pretty much anywhere. The Finns actually kept using this symbol long after World War II. In fact, they only finally got rid of all of them in 2017. Fun. What can I say about the T-26? It's the Vickers 6-ton, but not quite. So the Soviet Union bought a bunch of these during a trip to look at tractors, I think, sometime in the 1930s. They had their own production tank undergoing testing called the T-19, so they kind of matched the two against each other and eventually decided that some sort of hybrid between the two designs would work best. However, then came the next problem, and that problem was Poland had just purchased the two exact same tanks that the Soviets had, so the Vickers 6-ton and the Christie suspension tank, and were mass producing them, and for whatever reason, the Soviets saw Poland as their next biggest threat, and believed that the next war would be between them and Poland. So the hybrid 6-ton T-19 was abandoned, and the Vickers 6-ton was put into production because they could do it immediately. Now, of course, like everything, the Soviets and modern-day Russians proclaimed loudly that they didn't copy this inferior Western design, and to be fair, there are quite a few differences between the Vickers 6-ton and the T-28. I keep saying tongue instead of ton. Look, I'm tired. Shut up. Okay, so this thing, it's got a DP-28 machine gun instead of a Vickers. It's got round slits instead of rectangular ones. It's got a slightly different turret. It's a bit higher. The armor's a bit thicker. But that was not because they needed the heavier armor. 10mm of armor that this thing came with was enough to deal with most machine guns, but it was made of high-quality British steel, which the Russians were having great difficulty replicating. They only had one factory at the time capable of producing tanks, and that was in Leningrad, and the steel there was very poor quality. This is something that would come back to haunt them later on. They also swapped out the engine for the 4-cylinder Gas-26, and of course they fitted this much better gun onto it. So the Vickers 6-ton, maybe yes, but a greatly improved one at that. Trust me, in a toss-up between the two, you'd rather be in this thing. Well, no, you'd rather be the rifleman who can throw himself flat on the ground and get behind cover, rather than being the thing with a massive target on his head, and armor that couldn't protect against any of the anti-tank rifles the Finnish had in service at the time. But the most important thing is, the existence of this tank gave the Soviets the experience they needed to produce tanks. It helped them sort out all their steelworking issues, it helped them learn a lot about tank design and doctrine, and it even helped with a lot of their issues with mass production, which up until then had mostly been a lot of people in a room building stuff by hand. All of that would come in handy when designing and producing their later tanks. Essentially, the T-26 walked so the T-34 could run. And if you like the T-34, well, thank this thing, because if it wasn't for the T-26, the T-34, the Soviets' ability to mass produce tanks, the KV over there, none of that would have existed. Also something Finnish Winter War. Anyway, oh hello! I had no idea you were here. It's a Sentinel. It's a Mark I Sentinel. This is an Australian tank, famously the only Australian tank to be built in any significant numbers. This was a reaction to a potential Japanese invasion of Australia during the Second World War. The Aussies had asked Brits for tanks, and Britain had refused, so they made their own. They also made their own machine gun called the Owen, after being told they weren't getting any Stens. The Owen is actually vastly superior to the Sten in almost every way, but it does have a bit of a magazine issue. Anyway, Sentinel, sometimes this is wrongly attributed to being a copy of the Crusader tank. It's actually got more in common with the M3 Lee. It's got the same kind of lower hull, the same kind of transmission, the engine, etc, etc. The hull is also entirely cast from a single piece, as is the turret, making it an exceptionally durable, if a bit heavy. But for 1942, and for a country that had never built a tank before, this is surprisingly competent as a design. It's amazingly competent, in fact. That 2-pounder was literally because that was the only gun they had, and to be fair, it was expected to fight Haggles, which were very similar to the T-26 in the fact that they were a modification of the Vickers 6-ton, so not particularly formidable. But this thing could handle bigger guns. Famously, there's a picture of one with 2 25-pounder artillery guns in the turret to see if it could handle the recoil of a bigger gun, and it could, so they slapped a 17-pounder onto it. They had completed about 65 of these by about 1943, by which point American tanks started to become available in significant numbers, and it was decided to just go ahead and use those. Because the thing is, the Australians didn't have the same manufacturing capability as everyone else. They had precious few factories, so while they were building these, they couldn't build anything else. It was things like trains and railway cars that they were actually desperately short of. So unfortunately, these glorious vehicles were left in the shed. Up until about 1944, during the filming of The Rats of Tobruk, where they were dressed up and took the role of the German tanks, which is rather sadly their one and only use. Still, let us do as tradition dictates, because there is one prominent feature about this tank, which is usually the first thing anyone notices, it being Australian and the Australians being famed for their crass sense of humour. Let us now cup the balls. I think this is Belgian, just based on the camo scheme. Yes, this is a T-15. It's based on the Vickers Light commercial tank, which, as the name suggests, was a light tank built by Vickers for the export market. Similar to the Vickers 6 ton, but this is a lot lighter. It's about 3.8 tons, crew of 2, and built in a way that was fairly easy to swap out most of the components and replace them with your own. So it was literally built for you to buy a domestic production license and then just do what you wanted with it. This is likely one of the ones that were built for the Dutch, but never sent. I mean, after Dunkirk and the fall of France, they were still being produced. Actually, while we are here, when I was younger and a lot stupider, which you could imagine such a thing, some guy informed me that after the fall of France, Britain produced a number of French tanks, mainly R-35s, under license, but these were never issued to the troops, though they were painted with British markings and used as training. I think what he actually saw were these. Like I said, they were still being produced. They were meant to be for export to the Low Countries, but they had fallen. So what was the point? So the British just kept them and then apparently shipped them to a tank training ground for training purposes. That tank training ground being Bovington, which is here. And after all these years, one's still here, which is amazing. I love that. I just noticed the tank behind it as well. That's a Harry Hopkins. It's a British light tank named after, well, Harry Hopkins, who was the Secretary of Commerce during Roosevelt's New Deal, which even today people are still banging on about, whatever. It's one of the last of the line of light tanks that would be built by Vickers during the war years. It's meant to be a beefed up Tetrarch. 100 were built. They had a lot of issues. They were underpowered, it was slow, it was bad on inclines, the steering was an overcomplicated mess, and by the time these issues have been solved, it was like 1944 and Britain basically doesn't need them. There was some kind of idea to attach wings to them and then fly them to France, but that obviously never happened. Another fantastic view of the Pershing, and of course the rear of the Valiant. I've never been able to get this close to the Valiant. It has always been hidden. I feel so bad that it's just hidden back here behind everything else. What's this? A spare turret for a Mark 6, but what is this? It's got a brain carrier suspension. Is it a UC ammo carrier? Hang on, it's got a turret. Is this? Well, I mean, it's clearly not that. Oh, I know exactly what this is the praying mantis. What the fuck is it doing all the way back? You would never know this thing was here. It's completely hidden. Fucking hell. So this is a universal carrier, but it's got a turret on top of an extendable arm. That's not a remote turret, by the way. The operator is expected to sit in there somehow. I mean, yes, like a lot of British stuff, it was built by this mad, eccentric man who was like, I have a brilliant idea after a night of heavy drinking. Mr. Tapp, I think his name was. It was essentially designed to hide behind bushes and low walls and then pop up and fire down at anything hiding on the other side. It was a brilliant idea, but incredibly unpractical. Didn't work, gave the crew motion sickness, they kind of just forgot about it. There's one odd thing about this tank though, I mean apart from everything else. The turret has a grappling hook in the turret. Why? I've no idea, but I don't know why you'd utilize a grappling hook, but there you go, it's there. Don't quite know the kind of war that Mr. Tapp was thinking was going to take place, but there you go. Anyway, it's been fantastic seeing this. Just think, if I was on the tour and stuck up on the balcony, I would have no idea this was here. Now, I was just about to leave when I spotted something hidden in the middle that I'd walked past like an idiot. This is T-55 Alley. Now, I'm a bit of a fan of the T-55. This is honestly one of the best tanks the Soviets ever made. When you hear tales of the tank that shocked the West or the rugged simplicity of the Soviet vehicle, this is kind of what it's all in reference to. It does have its flaws, but it is a damn good tank. And the Tank Museum has a really good selection here. There was a T-54, there was a T-55, there was a Chinese copy of a T-55 called the Type 69. Nice. And then at the end, there was a Polish modernized T-55 that was in pretty awful condition. But that's not what I want to talk about, because I could bore you all day talking about T-55s and how much of an unspecified amount of currency I've offered certain contacts I have in Ukraine for one should one be captured, because the Russians are reactivating them and sending them into battle because we're 2 years into their 3-day special military operation and absolutely nothing has gone wrong. But what I really want is the M55S, which is the modernized version made by Slovenia, because I think it's one of the most adorable tanks ever made. I mean, look at that damn thing. It's like it's running up to you and goes, I'm a real main battle tank, guys. I can do it. Wait for me. It's also got this big anti-stupid panel on the front that lights up if there's a problem, and it tells you what the problem is. And it sits next to this fucking speedometer from a Ford Pinto, which is incredibly optimistic. I love this thing. Anyway, I want to talk about this headlight. Now that may seem a bit weird, but I get asked a lot about post-war T-34s and how to spot them, because a big problem you get with T-34s is a lot of the ones you see in museums are not World War II T-34s. T-34s were exported to almost every country in the world. They are one of the most exported tanks of all times. The problem was a lot of those T-34s were built to a much higher standard and have a lot more additions than their World War II counterparts. You also have the problem that a lot of actual World War II T-34s were refurbished in the 1950s, and those refurbs would keep their original serial numbers. So the number may identify the tank as being built in 1944 or whatever, but in actuality it was completely rebuilt in a Czechoslovakian factory in 1956. And that's a big problem. Even several of the T-34s here at Bovington are not World War II T-34s. In fact, one of them is a perfect example of the problem. Now, it wasn't on display, unfortunately. I couldn't find it here in the shed, but according to their website, one of them does carry the number plate of being made in 1944, but it has a Czechoslovakian-made turret, as well as a radio, so it's definitely a post-war refurb. Now, the staff here at the museum know how to spot things like that, but you'd be amazed just how many people don't. And that's where this light comes in. I'm going to quickly jump to footage I took of another museum. I know heresy, but deal with it. To this T-34. Now, the staff at this museum have unfortunately made that error. It's being presented as a genuine World War II T-34 built in 1944. But you see this lamp on the front. It's the same as the one on the T-55. This is one of the ways that you can tell if what you're looking at is a post-war production or a refurb. You can even see that same lamp on the T-34s Russia uses in its Victory Day parade, which is kind of ironic because it shows that this is not a World War II T-34, nor was it probably built in Russia. It's kind of like the Americans starting off their V-Day parade with a Canadian Grizzly, along with the turret. I mean, if you look at the famous graffiti tank on Mandela Way in London, though it has roughened with age and weather and all the spray paint that's been on it, the turret is quite smooth, and it is fully cast. We've also got the lamp. Every indication that this is a post-war Czechoslovakian model, and if you look up the tank's official history, you'll find that it was formerly a tank of the Czechoslovakian People's Army. Now, oddly enough, the T-34-85 the Tank Museum did have on display, this one here, this is a 1944 build, but it was captured in Korea in 52. I know this because the museum actually says that on their display. They're very honest about where their tanks actually come from, which I really love. Now, I don't know if this went through any post-war refurbishment or if the North Koreans did anything to modify the tanks. I don't think they did, so this is probably as close to a World War II T-34-85 as I'm ever going to get, unless there is a museum out there that has a genuine original, because if you do, I would love to see it. Anyway, as you've probably been aware, this video is a bit scuffed. I had intended to go around the whole museum, but it is quite big, so I only said one or two things about each tank I saw and then moved on. The cool World War I armored car. The cooler World War I armored car. This is why I'm making ample use of freeze frame, so you actually get to see the tanks that I'm talking about. There was a lot more in here than what I'm actually showing on camera. There was this boat thing that I couldn't get near. There was also this armored car thing that confused me, because how do you reload that, Bran? How do you reload that brand? There was also this tank here which I kept looking at because it looks like a Vickers medium, but it has an extra turret, and for a brief and terrifying moment, I thought this was the British tropical tank, which was an interwar tank built by a fucking madman for use in India and tropical climates, but it's not. And if you see my video I did with Falcon, this is the tank I was talking about. It's got tracks, and when you need to go fast, you get on a road, the tracks come up, and then the wheels go down, and then you drive it like an armored car. Now I get to point at it and say, see, it does exist, it is a thing, I didn't dream it. Also, it has a very unfortunate name. Also, the onboard mic of my camera was sort of picking up what I was saying, but also for reasons that I surmount to my own stupidity, I accidentally went to the museum during a midterm break, so there were children everywhere. Here's the audio of me looking at the TOG. Lots of kids, lots of kids, lots of kids with mothers looking at this creepy man walking around with a long jacket on holding a camera. I am genuinely surprised the museum didn't get any complaints. Though admittedly there was quite a lot more staff who seemed to be in the same room that I was in. Maybe that was a hint, I don't know. Anyway, I had a fantastic time. I did a video for the museum. It's a laugh. Go watch it on their channel. It might be out by the time I get this live. It might have been out for weeks by the time I get this out. I don't know. I'll link it in the description. Because Lindy Beige did a similar video, and that's sitting at 2.7 million views, and we can beat that boring beige fucker. 1 billion views! 1 billion views by Christmas, boys! If you liked this video, good. I'm not doing another one. I'll be back at the Tank Museum, maybe for Tank Fest. If you're there, come say hi, and then I can disappoint you in real life when you realize I wasn't lying. I do look like an angry potato that's come to life and is wearing someone else's skin suit. I'd like to thank the Tank Museum for putting up with me for the day. Subscribe to the Tank Museum, join their Patreon, something. Other videos where I don't show off how awkward and weird I am as a person will be coming out soon. That's it. Be gone. Ha 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 ha!